and well done to everybody for making it here. It's really good to see so many people, despite the train strike. We even have Charlotte, who has flown in from Washington, D.C. overnight. So if she falls asleep, somebody can nudge her, but I think she's allowed. You might have noticed we've started slightly later, just because we knew people would struggle to travel. And we're going to have a slightly shorter lunch break. That doesn't mean to say there won't be time to go into the Treasurer's room and buy lots of memorabilia. Please do, because my car boot was full and I don't want it to be full on the way back. So, and there's lots of good things in there, including some things that I will talk about later in my President's remarks, but please do go and have a look. Maggie and Sue have been here selling raffle tickets. If you haven't got your raffle tickets, there'll be a chance over lunch to buy raffle tickets, and that will be drawn at the end of the AGM this afternoon. So if you can't stay for that, just make sure somebody else is holding your ticket. Just a few... Oh, and the other thing to say is the Guild shop is not open this year because the people that were going to man the Guild shop can't get here because of the rail strike, and we didn't think it was fair to try and find other people and them to struggle in just for the hour that we would be there. So apologies for any of you that thought you'd be able to wander across to the Guild shop. I'm sure you're all aware that COVID is still it's going up, so please don't wander into any hospital buildings. Just keep yourselves to the square. Don't forget to go and have a look at the Bart's Rose. I haven't checked whether there's any buds on it, but you might want to go and have a look. A few housekeeping points. Obviously, fire exits there and there. Most people will have found the toilets. If you haven't, you go through the Treasurer's room and either down the stairs or down in the lift, and they're in the basement. When you come back out, if you are using the lift, please only press the button for the first floor on the left. It does say Great Hall, otherwise it opens into the Maggie Centre and you will get stuck. Those of us with a blue lanyard, I've taken mine off, but those of you with a blue lanyard will, they are committee members, so if anybody needs to speak to any of the members of the committee, then please do so. And if you have a spot on your name label, I will tell you what that means a bit later. And finally, Bryony, will you just stand up for a moment, please? Bryony is the all-day meeting coordinator, and this year has been a nightmare because people have forgotten their membership numbers, more of which later, and a train strike, so we've had lots of cancellations and last-minute alterations. Bryony has done a sterling job and definitely deserves a round of applause. Well done. So I'm delighted this morning to be able to welcome Professor Christine Hallett, who's Professor of Nursing History at the University of Huddersfield. I first met Christine when, as the new president of the League, I attended a meeting of the Ethel Gordon Fenwick Commemorative Partnership Group. Quite a long title. And Christine at that time was chairing it. And I learnt an awful lot about Ethel that day. Some I'd really only known before that she started the nurse register and had been a matron at Bart's. I now know far more about Ethel Gordon Fenwick, or as we know her, Ethel Bedford Fenwick, and I'm sure you'll find Christine's talk really interesting and will discover things you didn't know. So with no more ado, I'll introduce you to Christine.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth. I've got a bit of a whistle there. Is the sound okay? Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, just first of all to say I've got a cold. It's definitely a cold. I've got a negative lateral flow test, so I'm not going to be giving anybody COVID. But I'm staying away from everybody. I'm keeping a really good social distance. So bear with me. And once I've given my talk, and received my vote of thanks, which I'm looking forward to, I'll have to leave. I would have been staying with you for the whole day because it's great to be in a room with so many nurses. A lot of my public speaking is to historians, or sometimes in museums to members of the general public. So I rarely get to speak to a large group of nurses, and it's both a pleasure and very daunting because you remind me of a lot of the people who trained me back in most of you aren't old enough, but back in the 1980s was when I did my nurse training in the early 80s. And I feel that nursing was interesting in a different way when I was training, and it's changed such a lot. It's changed so much since I trained. I'm hearing noises of agreement. We could discuss that later. My talk isn't very long. It's going to be quite formal. I'll be reading from a script. It's not a very long talk. I don't think it is anyway. I've got a timekeeper here. But I think it will allow time for discussion at the end, questions and discussion, if you'd like to ask any questions. But equally, it's fine if you don't have any. Okay, so I shall launch into the script. And I've got my clicker. At some points, I'll just turn to the side. So if you lose the sound, just shout me. You can all shout if you want. We can't hear you. But I'll turn around a little bit from time to time. So, sorry it's a bit faint. But this is Ethel Gordon Fenwick, also known as Ethel Bedford Fenwick or Mrs. Bedford Fenwick. Elizabeth, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I do remember in the Ethel Gordon Fenwick Commemorative Partnership meetings, it is a mouthful, in the meetings how we did have several debates about Ethel's name, and I think we ended up just referring to her possibly slightly disrespectfully as Ethel. At times in this talk, I think I refer to her as either Ethel or Fenwick. She came to be known as Ethel Gordon Fenwick, or Mrs. Bedford Fenwick, because she married a doctor from the London hospital called Bedford Fenwick. And as all women did in those days, she took his name and became Mrs. Bedford Fenwick. And that's how she's been known, for most of the time. People have been writing histories of her life. So, but we've decided to call her Ethel Gordon Fenwick because that was her actual name. She was Ethel Gordon Manson and then married to become Ethel Gordon Fenwick. So she can be seen, and this is an image of her, the younger Ethel Gordon Manson. I think this is actually taken before she entered nurse training. I've got a number of different images of her, and some of that she looks quite gentle. She certainly looks very young, and she looks quite gentle and soft here. I've got some images that kind of show the other side to her. She was absolutely indomitable as a matron and then as a campaigner. So she can be seen as one of the most significant nurse reformers of modern times. Her pragmatic, dynamic, and determined approach to the development and regulation of the nursing profession brought her into conflict with many of the vested interests of her time, and she didn't mind conflict. I think she, in some ways, thrived on it. Her reforming programme, which began in 1887 with the creation of the British Nurses Association, enabled nurses to develop a professional identity and to set their own standards of clinical practice. Fenwick's focus was on the need for both regulation and training, and the results of her campaigning were the inauguration of a professional register for nurses, the creation of a general nursing council, the forerunner of today's Nursing and Midwifery Council, and the introduction of a national training curriculum for nurses. Her focus on regulation is sometimes seen as a counterfoil to the more vocational and moralising emphasis of Florence Nightingale, whose work is much better known. But Ethel Gordon Fenwick should be equally well known. In reality, both women, in very different ways, raised the profession of nursing from its 19th century origins as simply employment for women to the level of an independent profession with a clear identity. So I'll just show you this image of the Nurses Registration Act. You probably can't read it, you don't need to read it. Shortly I'll try and read some of the text off some of the slides, we'll see how I succeed with that. But this is her most significant piece of work, the Nurses Registration Act, which passed through Parliament finally on the 23rd of December 1919, just after the First World War. And partly in recognition of the amazing work that nurses had done during the First World War. So Fenwick's influence was felt both in Britain and at an international level. The British Nurses Association, the organisation she founded to support her campaign for a nurses' professional register, gained royal patronage in 1893 and is still in existence today. So it became the Royal British Nurses Association, the RBNA, and it is still going strong today. Her fight for registration lasted for over 30 years. It was a 30-year battle and culminated in this Nurses Registration Act, passed on the 23rd of December 1919. She also edited one of the earliest nursing journals, the British Journal of Nursing. Not the same British Journal of Nursing as I think exists today. That's got a different history. This one grew out of a journal she bought with her husband, a journal called the Nursing Record, and she changed its name to the British Journal of Nursing. This was a publication that focused much of its attention on the professional development of nursing, but which also had a recurring item called Outside the Gates. There was a column with every issue of the journal called Outside the Gates, which openly expressed support for the women's suffrage campaign. And that was quite rare for nurses. They usually stayed out of those kinds of contentious issues. Well, many did, or many kept their views quite privately to themselves. I'm sure there was a lot of support amongst them for women's suffrage, but Ethel Gordon Fenwick campaigned openly within her journal for votes for women. On a global level, Fenwick influenced the professionalisation of nursing through her work as a founder member, the first president of the International Council of Nurses, founded in 1899. So she not only helped found it, but she was also its first president. And the International Council of Nurses now represents over 20 million nurses worldwide through 130 national nurses associations. So it is huge. And she, along with Lavinia Dock from the USA and Agnes Karl from Germany, she founded that organization. And she was the real driving force behind it. I don't know where she got her energy from. She was an incredibly energetic campaigner and founder and reformer. So her background, born in Elgin, Scotland, and raised in Thoroton, Nottinghamshire, Fenwick trained as a professional nurse in Manchester and Nottingham and went on to become a matron of St Bartholomew's Hospital, London, at the age of 24. Imagine that. So she was made matron of this amazing establishment at the age of 24. Whilst grounded in the culture and expectations of her own time, she can be seen as a woman who has great relevance today. In line with her ardent support for the Millicent Fawcett non-militant arm of the movement for female suffrage, she believed in women's capacity for professionalism and accountability. Her vision was to ensure the fledgling profession of nursing delivered high-quality care for patients and that, in return, nurses were not exploited, well, this is topical, isn't it, but given decent pay and working conditions. This was, and still can be, viewed as essential to attract and retain the desired calibre of entrant to the profession. Okay, so just going back to her portrait for a minute. Ethel Gordon Manson was born in 1857 in Morayshire, Scotland, as I mentioned, in Elgin. Her father died when she was still a baby, and her mother remarried a few years later. So Ethel's stepfather, who was one of her great supporters and mentors, was George Storer, and he was a member of Parliament. And Ethel grew up in Thoroton, Nottinghamshire, I think in quite a political household and in quite a political environment. She decided at the age of 21 to become a nurse and began her training as a probationer at the Nottingham Children's Hospital. So that was her first training. 21 was too young to be permitted to enter formal training, so Ethel was marking time in Nottingham, but gaining a lot of training from the Nottingham Children's Hospital. And that was the first influence on her professionally. As a middle-class wealthy lady, she was able to pay for her training and was designated as a paying or special probationer. So there were ordinary probationers and special probationers. And if you were a lady, you didn't want to be an ordinary probationer. The class system was very entrenched at the time. You didn't want to be an ordinary because that would immediately disqualify you from being a middle-class lady. You would become working class. So these ladies who had the means and the desire to stay within their class paid for their training and were referred to as specials. After 6 months at the Nottingham Children's Hospital, Fenwick made her debut as a general nurse, entering the Manchester Royal Infirmary in September 1878, again as a special probationer. So I'll just go to image of MRI for you. There we are, yeah. So this image is from a slightly earlier date. Not from Ethel Gordon Fenwick's time there, it's slightly earlier. But it would have looked very much like this. So it's a fairly contemporary image of the Manchester Royal Infirmary. So Ethel Gordon Fenwick's, one of her biographers, Winifred Hector, confirmed with the assistance of Manchester Royal Infirmary historian William Brockbank that Ethel had indeed been a special probationer at Manchester, because there was some dispute over that. She had been a special probationer at Manchester, having paid £6.10 for her 1-year training. Brockbank wrote that the probationary period, even for specials like Fenwick, Manson, as she was at the time, commenced with the hard labour and menial work of scrubbing floors, cleaning out grates, and laying fires, before the novice progressed to hands-on care and then more technical work. So even for these special probationers, who sound a bit elitist to us, I know, they did start at the bottom, very much. A nurse training remained that way, really right up until my time in the 80s, I think, where there was a kind of hierarchy of tasks that you would fulfill. And in your first year, to be honest, I didn't do a lot of cleaning. I think that really had been phased out by the 1980s. But in Ethel's time and right through to the mid-20th century, those were your first tasks. And it was a kind of discipline that people learned. So this wealthy lady, genteel lady from Thoroton, from a political family in Thoroton, would have been, sweeping and scrubbing floors, laying fires for the first few weeks, at least, months of her training. And then moving up to hands-on nursing care and then to more technical work. In 1880, of 50 nurses taken on, only 15 completed their training. So that tells you something about attrition. I'm just going to move out of the light. Yeah, bear with me. I am speaking to you as well. I just want to move out of that. I've got the sun on me just for the moment. It'll move. It will move. Yeah, thank you. That's a nice way of putting it, thank you. Attrition was amazing in the late 19th century. Of 50 nurses in her group taken on, only 15 completed the training. 20 were dismissed, 6 died, 2 left due to illness, and the remaining 7 resigned for various reasons. So it was frequently noted in nurses' files that a nurse's health had, quote, failed, and that she was, quote, not strong enough. So it was really tough work. She was not strong enough to continue her training. So Ethel Gordon-Fenwick clearly was strong enough to continue and to complete her training. And having completed that one-year training at Manchester, she took the position as Sister of Charlotte Ward at the London Hospital, Whitechapel. So having her time at Nottingham and then her time at Manchester, she immediately went into a sister's position at the London Hospital. In 1881, she was appointed matron at St Bartholomew's Hospital, as I've said, at the age of 24. So it was a really meteoric rise. I have, of course, got an image of Bart's. Still looks very... Once you get into the right position and you're looking at the old edifice of this part of the building, it still looks very much the same. And her work at Bart's really was... It was an archetype and a precursor of the work she then went on to do, the national and international work that she went on to do. While she was here, what was important to her was to make sure that she regulated and reformed the training at Bart's. And she was very determined to establish a training that would be fixed quite clearly and would remain in place for decades. She wanted it to be just in the kind of outlines and form that she felt was right. So it was a 3-year training. The 3-year training became a bit controversial later on because the London Hospital training was a 2-year training. And when Fenwick campaigned for registration later on, after she'd married and left nursing, she and all of those around her, and then eventually it was fixed in legislation, she insisted on a 3-year training rather than a 2-year training. But that all started here at Bart's. I wouldn't say the work she did was experimental, but it was very determined and very structured. And she does seem to be the kind of person who would brook no opposition, So the training that probably you all did probably owed a lot to the reforms that she'd put in place in the late 19th century. I'm not saying it hadn't changed by the 20th century, but it owed a lot to her work. Okay, so 6 years after she became matron here at St Bartholomew's Hospital, she had to leave because she married Dr. Bedford Fenwick, a doctor at the London Hospital. And there were no married nurses in the 1880s. You couldn't be married and be a nurse. It was a very different time from our own. I've already mentioned the elitism, the fixedness of the class system. But in terms of gender, society was very fixed as well. You could be a nurse and a matron. You could be a leader, really, important leader within a hospital, as long as you were single. But the minute you got married, your husband and anticipated children were your only concern, not just your first concern, but your only concern. And it was believed that you couldn't split yourself. You couldn't give as much of yourself as you should to your patients, and also give as much of yourself as you should to your family. You couldn't do both. That belief was very firmly held, which of course makes us feel a sense of how self-sacrificing nurses within the profession were at the time, seen as a kind of giving over of yourself, either to your work or to your family. And you couldn't do both. You couldn't have it all. That phrase would have absolutely astonished and alarmed people. So the interesting thing as well about her links with Bedford Fenwick and her links with the London Hospital is they've kind of thrown up interesting ideas and gossip, really, I would say, and stories and myths about Ethel Gordon-Fenwick and Eva Luckers, the matron of the London Hospital at the same time, because it has been said, and it may or may not be true, that they were rivals for the affections of Bedford Fenwick, Dr. Bedford Fenwick, and that the roots of their opposition to each other can be found in their rivalry to marry this doctor. So they followed very different trajectories after Ethel Gordon Manson married Fenwick. Eva Luckers just remained a matron of the London hospital. She stayed there. She devoted the whole of the rest of her life until she died, kind of in harness, as people say, to the London hospital. Ethel Gordon Fenwick, because forced out of her matronship, handing over to Isla Stewart, who was another indomitable, fantastic, amazing and brilliant leader. She was able to hand over to somebody she really respected. But her work took off in a different direction because she couldn't remain as the matron of St Bartholomew's Hospital. And I don't know whether they were love rivals or not, I think that they had differences of opinion, and very marked and determined differences of opinion, because they just saw the future of the nursing profession differently. There was that genuine debate about regulation and registration, whether we should have a nurses' register or not. And of course, Fenwick was on the side of the register, which tends to be, I think, the side that nurses are on today. I think we find it difficult to understand the opposition of Eva Luckers and Florence Nightingale to the register. But it's partly to do with what different times those were, how the times were so different. Okay, so it would be another half century before women would be allowed to remain in work whilst being married. So it'd be a long time after this before matrons could be married and nurses could be married. Were you not allowed to? What year was that? 63, and you left in that year because of marriage, right? You stayed and didn't get married? Oh, did you forced the issue? Yeah. I had thought it was around the late 50s and the early 60s that those regulations were gradually loosened. So it didn't happen suddenly, it happened quite gradually. Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it, how, I don't want this to sound critical, but nursing tended to be a bit more traditional and behind, in a sense, kind of determined to kind of hold on to its traditions longer than other professions in the mid-20th century, which is one of the interesting features. It was a long time before things suddenly started to change rapidly, even the uniform. I think we all wore dresses, didn't we? And, belts and collars and caps. Yeah, and things only changed quite quickly, I think, in the 90s. Okay, so I think I want to read a slide now, if I can. I'll just see if it's possible. Let's have a look. Yeah, actually, I was going to give you a few dates, but you probably don't need them. Dates are not the most interesting part of the subject. I'll read the ones I can see. In 1899, that was the year that Ethel founded the International Council of Nurses. And she'd already been campaigning. Bills had been, I don't think you might be able to see it, but a couple of bills had been presented to Parliament in the early 20th century, I think 1903, one of them. But then in 1905, a select committee of the House of Commons found in favour of a state register for nurses. So that was a very significant year, 1905, and we still have all the evidence that was collected by that select committee. It's really interesting to read what Fenwick said, what Luckers said, what representatives of Nightingale said, what other leading nurses said, the different ideas and different debates. And then on the 23rd of December, the Nurses Registration Act was passed. It's lovely, that sunshine, isn't it? But just in the wrong place for today. Okay, so in 1887, Ethel founded the British Nurses Association, which was granted its Royal Charter, as I've said, in 1893. The Royal British Nurses Association, the RBNA, is still there today. She bought and began to edit the Nursing Record, as I mentioned, in 1893. So she was very active in the late 80s and early 90s. That was when she became an editor of a journal as well, 1893. And she worked on that with her husband. I think they must have had a really great relationship, both personally and professionally, because they worked on that journal together. I mean, their relationship wasn't great, by all accounts. After some time, I think she had quite a lot to put up with, to be honest, I'll say delicately, after maybe the first several years of marriage. But professionally, she and Bedford Fenwick did work quite closely together. And Ethel became the president of the Society of Women Journalists from 1910 to 1911. So her work took her beyond nursing, into journalism more broadly as well. She was the president of the Society for Women Journalists. In 1894, she founded the Matrons' Council of Great Britain and Ireland with her friend and successor at St Bartholomew's, Isla Stewart. I think the next slide might be... Okay, yeah, that's... Here's an image of with Isla Stewart. I hope you can see her, with Bart's nurses around her. Okay, so she'd founded the Matrons' Council of Great Britain and Ireland with Isla Stewart, who was a great ally. So as well as continuing the work at St Bartholomew's, Stewart also worked with Ethel Gordon Fenwick. Every time Fenwick founded an organisation to campaign for reform in nursing, hospital administrators and doctors who weren't very supportive and nurses who weren't very supportive tended to infiltrate it and take it over. And then she would found another organisation, and they would try and infiltrate that. And the politics were quite intriguing at the time. But if she found that she wasn't quite able to do what she wanted to do with, for example, the Royal British Nurses Association and with the registration campaign, she just formed a new organisation. And in this case, it was the Matrons' Council. At the 1899 meeting of the International Council of Women in London, Fenwick proposed the founding of the International Council of Nurses. So it was when she was at the International Council of Women that she, of course, so many of the women there would have been nurses because it was such an important profession for women at the time. So that was where she first proposed its foundation. And the first meeting of the ICN was in Buffalo in 1910. And Fenwick was its president for its first 5 years. So as well as campaigning for registration, setting up these organisations, continuing to have an interest in what was happening here at Bart's, and founding the International Council of Nurses and being one of the leading women's journalists in the world. She was actually president of the International Council of Nurses and did quite a lot of travelling. She never stayed still. So Fenwick founded a number of organisations to act as campaigning platforms for state registration. Having lost control of the RBNA in 1902, she founded the Society for the State Registration of Nurses. So I think she thought, okay, so I was in control of the Royal British Nurses Association, but they didn't want to go in the same direction as me, and I'd really been wrested away from her. She thought, well, let's just call it what it is, and let's found this organisation, the Society for the State Registration of Nurses, because that was what really mattered to her. That became the absolute lodestone, the foundation for what she wanted to do. If she could found a register for nurses, there was a lot of other work she could do as well around that, including a curriculum for nurse training and the setting of standards for nursing. If you could get the register, fix the boundaries around the profession, say that only registered people can call themselves a registered nurse, then you can do all kinds of reforming work within that. So she founded in 1904, the National Council of Nurses of Great Britain and Ireland. It gets a bit confusing, the number of different organisations she founded. So the Society for the State Registration of Nurses, the Matrons Council, the National Council of Nurses of Great Britain and Ireland, and that acted as a constituent council of the International Council of Nurses. That's how the ICN works. It's got affiliate organisations from each country. So she founded a council to work with the ICN. One of her primary interests was in creating an international sisterhood of nurses, and she was very successful in that. It was during her time in the 19th century, in the late 19th century and early 20th century, that nursing really did become an international profession, with nurse training in many different countries right across the world being modelled on British nurse training. And that wasn't just within the British dominions, later the Commonwealth. It was in countries right across Europe and right across the world, in all continents. She did some important work also during the First World War. She co-founded an organisation called the French Flag Nursing Corps, a unit that provided fully trained British nurses to French military hospitals on the Western Front. French Flag Nursing Corps was a really interesting organisation. So it was one of her ways of showing that really only trained nurses should be doing significant work, such as caring for the wounded in wartime. The First World War was seen as something of a crusade on all sides, within all the combatant nations. And the young men who went to fight during that war, they were sacred, they were important to their societies. That had all kinds of knock-on effects, for things like pacifism, where you're an absolute outcast if you're a pacifist. Again, it's a society which was somewhat different from our own, but the fervour, and I think, that this is still there today. The support and the fervour and the people were absolutely passionate about the care of their soldiers and the care of their wounded. And Fenwick felt the idea that volunteer nurses with something like 6 weeks training could be doing highly technical work, caring for soldiers. That was anathema to her. So one of the ways in which she was able to do something to bring trained nurses, fully trained nurses, into the zone of the armies close to the battlefield was by founding this French Flag Nursing Corps, because she was rather cut out of involvement in the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service. The politics were kind of excluding her from that a little bit. So she of course, as always, she founded her own organisation. So finally, on the 23rd of December, 1919, Fenwick's greatest wish was attained when the British Parliament passed the Nurses Registration Act, inaugurating a professional register for British nurses. And Fenwick herself signed the register as State Registered Nurse number 1, which is very fitting. There's there is an actual register, there is a book, a register that you can actually look at. You can open this. It's at the National Archives, isn't it? Not here. You don't hold a copy here, do you? No, I thought it was at the National Archives. But it's well worth a look because she and a group of other senior nurses and matrons who had supported her, they're all named on the first page with their home addresses and where they'd trained. And she was SRN number 1. And she then took her place as a member of the new council that was then formed. Okay, so just move on. And this is her grave in Thoroton in Nottinghamshire. She died in March 1947, knowing that her battle for the state registration, the state recognition of the nursing profession had been won, but also knowing that part of her legacy was the need to remain vigilant and to defend both that recognition and the autonomy of nurses. She'd been vigilant during the First World War, wasn't that she opposed the introduction of VAD, volunteer nurses, but she was adamant that movement should be kept very carefully under control, and it was trained nurses who mattered, because you couldn't have VADs without trained nurses to mentor them. They wouldn't get anywhere, and they could be quite dangerous in their practice. So it was the trained nurses who mattered. And then during the Second World War, VADs were reintroduced again, but on a much smaller scale. But again, she was very vigilant and arguing in her journal, against any expansion of that kind of volunteer movement. You can't be a volunteer nurse and be a fully competent, proficient nurse. You have to have, she was really the first person to argue that you have to have a really good ratio of trained nurses to patients. You can have volunteers by all means, if you want, but the ratio, the nurse-patient ratio, has to be good enough, and that has to be set, that standard, and those numbers have to be set by a council of nurses who know what they're talking about, the General Nursing Council. So if we look at the development of the council, which defended the regulation, education and autonomy of British nurses, we can see a process of change and often of compromise with the government's priorities. They did find themselves having to compromise. I think I've got a slide with this. Yeah, there we go. The first council was known as the Caretaker Council and was charged with both establishing the professional register and electing a permanent council. That first elected council was not fully established. The work was onerous and lengthy because of, it was something very new. There was a political turmoil in the background to it. It took a long time to form the first council, but it was fully established by 1923. The 1949 Nurses Act permitted the inclusion of members from all National Health Service regions to the council. So that was the next significant act of Parliament, permitting National Health Service regions. That was just after the establishment of the NHS. And then in 1979, the 1979 Act established the UKCC. We'll all remember the UKCC, the United Kingdom Central Council for Nursing, Midwifery and Health Visiting, bit of a mouthful, a body with which, many of us are no doubt familiar. And then in 2002, that body, the UKCC, was dissolved and replaced by the Nursing and Midwifery Council. But there's a continuity between the General Nursing Council, the UKCC, and then the present NMC. And I think the NMC is still kind of fighting for its autonomy. I think it's quite threatened from time to time. Since its first inception as a registered profession in 1919, nursing has undergone a number of gradual shifts driven by social, cultural and technological change within British healthcare and British society more broadly. The indomitable Ethel Gordon-Fenwick, so you'll like this picture, if it's the right one. Yeah, that's the one. I'm not sure how well you can see her, but this is an image of her looking rather fierce during her suffrage campaigning days. The indomitable Ethel Gordon-Fenwick can be seen to have been very much ahead of her time, driving forward many changes that have subsequently come to be seen as self-evidently desirable, but in their day were viewed as at best avant-garde and at worst dangerously destabilizing. She really frightened people at the time. The Victorian and then the Edwardian societies in which Fenwick was operating were entrenched in patriarchy, with healthcare dominated by medical and commercial vested interests. It's difficult from a 21st century vantage point to appreciate just how obstructively the odds were stacked against Fenwick and her fellow campaigners. And this is why the recent work of the Ethel Gordon Fenwick Partnership, led by Liz Howard Thornton, has been so important. And the most recent chair of that partnership was, of course, Elizabeth. That organisation did some really important and significant work, and it was great the way you drew it to a close. I'm just going to show you some images of that work. I hope you can see something of them. So this is actually the gravestone. Ethel's grave is in the churchyard, in a small country churchyard in a village called Thoroton in Nottinghamshire. I would recommend a visit. I would highly recommend that you go and visit and have a look at this. This is what it looked like when the work of renovating it and commemorating Fenwick first began. And Nick, on the right there, if you can see, is Nick Finlay, who was the church warden, who was really important, did some really important work in establishing this project. And then at the time, the vicar of the church was Bryony, who's on the other side of the grave there. They started the work. And this is what it looks like now. I don't think those same flowers are still there, but the grave has been renovated. It looks magnificent. It's quite a moving place to visit. You know, if you're interested in this kind of thing, the significance of her work, you know, there's a bench there as part of the project. A seat was put in place funded by the RBNA, and you can go and visit Ethel Gordon Fenwick's graveside. So just leaving you with that slide, I'll just draw to a close. Apart from the significant campaign of the Ethel Gordon Fenwick Commemorative Partnership, Ethel Gordon Fenwick has received little formal recognition at a national level for her work until her death at the age of 90 in 1947. So she had 90 years from adulthood onwards, and from early adulthood, those years, all of those years, from the age of 21 to the age of 90, were spent working for the sake of nursing. She never retired. Her legacy lives on quietly through the existence of the British Nurses Professional Register, the International Council of Nurses, the Royal British Nurses Association, and an independent nursing press. All of those things are largely due to her. And that's it. Thank you. So I suspect there's plenty of time, is there, for questions? Oh, we got two mics too close. Yeah.
Absolutely, there are time for questions. So, as you can see, we've got two roving mics. So, anybody want to start asking Christine a question?
Christine, thank you so much for an extremely interesting presentation. I'm very interested, coming from Ireland, when you talk about the marriage bar, and when you speak about how, you know, pervasive it was, how tightly held it was.
Yeah.
In Ireland, we have decided to blame the Catholic Church. Isn't it wonderful? And we've actually decided to blame nuns. I'm a nun. And it's very refreshing, and not the only reason why I come back to Bart's, to actually hear that the issue is much bigger and was right across, really, I suppose, the world. And again, I suppose another feature that I'm interested in, coming from a convent background, where we battle with the Vatican as opposed to the British Parliament, is how with each organisation that she founded, when it was, you know, if you like, taken over or taken from her, how she very cleverly founded another. And we've done that in religious women's orders as well. And that's one of the reasons why you have so many different orders, because the Vatican moved in, decided to enclose us, and then another group brought us out. So there are so many parallels, aren't there, in the movement of women, and women being professional, and women in service, and women in professional service. Thank you so much.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, those are all really important points. Just talking about the marriage bar, first of all, just bear with me. With the marriage bar, now I don't know much about the general history of the marriage bar, so I don't want to say anything that wouldn't be correct, but my understanding is that it was in place for women across a range of professions, but it was really fixed within the civil service legally. You know, it was the civil service that was adhering to that marriage bar, and other professions kind of just recognized that as the norm at the time and followed it. I think teachers, it was very much in place for teachers. I think legally there was a marriage bar. I think legally for nurses there was a marriage bar. So it's civil service and the professions. But the breaking down of that marriage bar, I think, is a more complex history. And it happened at different times within different professions. I think it was fairly decisively broken down within the civil service. And it was only after, I think nursing actually clung on to it for a while longer. And it was nursing itself, you know, I like to whitewash us as a profession, but, you know, we are sometimes somewhat responsible for some of the things that happen ourselves as well. You know, that for whatever reasons, you know, nurses were quite reactionary about this, you know, that they did cling on to it for longer than other professions. And then talking about nurses and nursing as a women's profession that kind of found its way around obstacles and opposition. Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, you make a really important point there. And it happened in Britain, it happened in the Protestant Britain, just as it did in Catholic Ireland and amongst groups of nurses in Germany, which was both Protestant and Catholic, and in France, you know, across Europe. In the mid-19th century, even before Ethel's time, sisterhoods, nursing sisterhoods, were finding their way and feeling their way. You know, they established the first training for nurses. You could argue that the first formal training for nurses was Elizabeth Fry's training, her sisterhood, in 1840 in Britain. But in Catholic Europe, actually, there'd been a much more of a continuity, a continuous tradition from the Middle Ages. But in Britain, it was religious sisterhoods, Protestant religious sisterhoods, that set themselves up as groups of nursing sisterhoods and then carved their way and found their way. And they were hemmed in by the power of two different groups of men within the hospitals, the hospital administrators and the hospital doctors. And they often came into a kind of polite conflict with those groups. And sometimes it wasn't so polite. You know, at times, I think Guy's Hospital had quite a major dispute, you know, around the role of the nurse and how subservient the nurse should be to the doctor. You know, whether nurses should have an autonomous role of their own. There were some very prominent disputes in the mid to late 19th century. So Ethel Gordon Fenwick was stepping into that existing, you know, feeling of pushing against the boundaries, nursing pushing against the boundaries, and that being a very gendered battle. So yeah, it doesn't. I don't know much about Irish nursing history, but it doesn't surprise me at all that it was possibly even more fierce. Maybe, you know, the kind of the support for and love of, but opposition to the Vatican, you know, and the Catholic Church. It's so complex, isn't it? You know, that they didn't want to get on the wrong side of the organisations they genuinely supported.
Thank you. Got a question at the back, and then lady in front.
My name's Philippa Sully, and I actually did my general nurse training in Johannesburg. Now, my grandmother trained at St. Thomas's, and when I said I was going nursing, I'm sharing this with you because I think it's very relevant, because I remember it, and Nellie fell down in a dead faint, having been brought up on how wonderful Florence Nightingale was. She said her words exactly were, that, pardon the vernacular, ladies, that bloody flow. So I said, what do you mean by that? Shock horror. She said, ruined nursing for the nurses. We weren't allowed out. She said they worked us so hard that I lost my periods and had to have time off work because we worked so hard. She said it was all right for Flo, she was rich. We weren't, and my grandmother was the daughter of a builder. They weren't poor, but they weren't sort of upper middle class professional people then. And she said she used to have to bribe the hospital porter with half a crown, she said, if we wanted to go out to meet our young men. And I've read some feminist critiques of the 70s saying this was taking women from the patriarchy of their fathers into the patriarchy of the hospital and the medical profession. And in actual fact, I'm sure you do know that South Africa was the first country in the world to register nurses by law, and they were decades ahead of Britain. They registered them in 1906, I think I'm right in saying. Medical and Dental Act.
Yeah, possibly even earlier. And then New Zealand was the next. Yeah.
Or 1902, or sometime between, before 1910 anyway.
Yeah, and it was South Africa first, then New Zealand, and then some of the American states.
But
Yeah.
I just think, looking back at the history, that within living memory, I can see the difference. I was locked in at 7 o'clock at night as a student nurse in 1968.
Yeah, it really has changed. In the last, what are we looking at there? 70, 80, 90, 100, 50 years, 60 years, 50 or 60, 5 or 6 decades. It's changed dramatically in many ways. Not always for the better. In some ways for the better, but I think there are a lot of ways in which it actually distresses me to see some of the changes that have taken place in nursing and what the practice of nursing now is and what nurses won't do that we would have taken for granted was our work, and our role. Coming back to Flo, though, there was a group there, and Florence Nightingale and Eva Luckers were very prominent within that group, who in their own different way, they were campaigning for nursing, but they were very anxious that nurses, Florence Nightingale said, nurses must not become dictionaries, and their profession is a moral profession. It's about caring. And she was frightened, and I think we know enough now to understand her fears. She was frightened that nurses would just become ciphers and just follow not necessarily doctor's orders, but just follow protocols, which did kind of, that it always has been a tension within our lifetimes, hasn't it? I struggle to really feel sympathy and see where Florence Nightingale and Eva Luckers were coming from, but I think they are deserving of sympathy as well. I just side with Ethel Gordon-Fenwick because, as I say, it seems self-evident to me. But I think we have to be aware. I have to be aware, and if you happen to feel the same as me, we have to be aware that taking sides from the vantage point of the 21st century when life is just so different. I think had we actually been not only dropped into the 1860s, 70s and 80s, but actually lived that life as women, as girls, and then women growing up, we could have gone either way. We could have felt either way. She really was ahead of her time. But yeah, one of the things that's prominent about a lot of the training in the late 19th century is how harsh it was. I mentioned Manchester Royal Infirmary and 6 of the nurses in Ethel's cohort dying during training. It was really hard. And there was a committee of inquiry, a parliamentary inquiry into that. There's an inquiry into the London hospital because so many nurses were dying at the hospital. So there was a lot of concern about it. I think very few suicides. I'm not aware of any figures. Yeah, infection, which is understandable because you're working with infectious patients, but at the same time, the rate was higher even than you would expect it to be. You'd expect it to be higher amongst nurses than amongst women in other lines of work. But it was even higher than anticipated at the time, especially at the London hospital. So the finding was that the nurses didn't get enough nutrition and they didn't get enough rest. And that all got caught up and entangled up in all the politics, between nurse leaders, between different nurse leaders. There was a tendency to be accusing of each other rather than pulling together as a profession. But that's understandable too, because these issues, they felt so passionately about these issues. But it was harsh, and harsher than it should have been at the time.
So my question's been answered, I think. My question was around what was the nature of the opposition, those that vehemently opposed registration, what was their rationale for that? But I think you might have answered that in looking at...
Yeah, and yet I haven't, because I find it difficult to understand, and nobody's ever really explained it very clearly for me in anything I've read. I think the person who's come closest is probably Susan McGann, who wrote The Battle of the Nurses, which is a great book. It was published, I think, in 1992, so it's a bit dated now, but I think it's still the best thing to read on this subject. And she has a separate chapter on each of the leading nurses or matrons of the time. So she's got a chapter on Eva Luckers, a chapter on, I think there is one on Florence Nightingale, I'm not sure actually, but one on Ethel Bedford Fenwick, as she calls her. And she does address the nature of the pro-registration and anti-registration lobbies. She never quite tells you, even Susan McGann never quite tells you what their objection to a register was. And, kind of scratch your head really, don't you? Think it's just a register, and it surely that places boundaries around the profession so that only properly trained people, it makes nursing safe and safer. It was to do with not wanting to turn nurses into either doctors or scientists. It was to do with that. It was a fear that once there was a register and a national curriculum, nursing would go in a direction that its founding matriarchs, and she would see herself as one of them, Nightingale, had not intended. And also a lot of the opposition was from hospitals, because most hospitals, prominent hospitals, didn't want nurses to have a register and be a defined profession, because they wanted their nurses to be loyal to the hospital, not to the profession. It was the hospital that mattered. So that was a real pull away from registration and an obstruction to registration.
Thank you.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it is. I think the hospitals feared it, though, at the time, because they felt they would lose control of their workforce. Yeah. So, I mean, we all know that I think people are always attached to their alma mater, wherever it was they trained. And you wouldn't lose that. But it's more about terms and conditions and keeping the costs down, actually. It's more actually about that than it is about loyalty itself.
Yeah. I'd like to ask, because not having read so much about her, which biography would you recommend as the best one to read? Is there one, or does it depend on which side you want to look at of her life?
So there are two really good biographies of Ethel Gordon Fenwick. Winifred Hector's, that I already mentioned, and Jenny Main's biography, which is a much more recent biography of her. My personal favourite is Winifred Hector's, but Jenny Main's is a great book. It's a great piece of work and a great piece of research and really well written. What I like about Winifred Hector is that she's almost like an Ethel Gordon Fenwick in herself. She's half of the book is about Fenwick and half of the book is about nurse registration and how we must never lose it, and how important it is and how we must never lose it. So Jenny Main's book is much more measured and balanced, and it's a biography. It's a proper biography of a figure, of a significant figure. I would recommend that you read both. Jenny Main's is going to be much easier to get hold of because I think it's just come out with Pen and Sword books very recently, so you can buy it quite easily. So
Christine,
I'd recommend that.
Smiling because a lot of us in this room know Winifred Hector.
Right.
She was a Barts nurse, and I still have the Winifred Hector book that we were all told to buy at the beginning of our training.
Yeah.
So
I've got a copy of that, yeah. Yeah. She was another indomitable, and I think she was just in the tradition of these indomitable matrons. I think she identified with Fenwick and saw herself as part of that line of, inheritance of, holding this, this banner or holding the torch and not letting it go out, holding the torch for professional nursing.
Christine, you're clearly a very knowledgeable historian on nursing. Bringing us up to date, what do you think each of them would have thought about becoming a graduate profession? And interestingly, Miss Hector pioneered the degree programme for nurses here.
Yeah.
I'd just be interested in your views on what they would have done about that now, because it's still very topical.
Yeah, I think it's something that Ethel Gordon-Fenwick would have strongly supported, and probably she may even have seen that on the horizon for the future. I think it was interesting, wasn't it, when nursing education moved into the universities. It was a really turbulent time, and there was always a fear, quite a well-founded one, that nurses in training and post-training would lose their ties and their connections and this loyalty we've just talked about to their training establishment, and that would be sad. And I think actually that probably has come to pass to a certain extent. But I think Ethel Gordon, she was for the profession rather than for the institution, the hospital. What she wanted was for nurses, and women's freedom was so important to her as well, women as well as women as nurses. She wanted them to be able to travel, do whatever they wanted, work in any part of the country, leave their hospital and go somewhere else and kind of take whatever message they'd learned from, say, Bart's and take that to other hospitals. So she wanted that freedom, autonomy and mobility, but she also wanted a very clear training and education for nurses. She wanted it to be both a training and an education. And she saw that women had a right, all women had a right to an education to whatever level they chose. So as a principle, I think that was important to Ethel Gordon-Fenwick. Nightingale, I just don't think it would have entered her thinking. She saw nursing as the nurse is almost like a nun. We've talked about nuns as nurses. When you become a nurse, you kind of take on the uniform, you take on the cap, just like a nun taking on a habit, and you take on the whole persona of a nurse. It's not about being trained or educated, although she did institute the first secular training program in the UK, so I mustn't overstate that case. And she did bring in doctors to give lectures to the nurses. So, there was science and technology and skills training there, but it was the moral nature and persona of the nurse that was most important to her. And she feared that nurses could be overtrained. She really worried about that. There was such a thing as overtraining, which again, it's quite a strange idea to us, isn't it? That anybody can be overtrained in their profession or in their discipline.
Was that public kind of feeling about that? Because I remember when I started my nurse training, my mother said, when 73, 10 years after someone quoted that if I 10 years earlier I wouldn't have been able to. 10 years earlier, I wouldn't have been able to do it if I got married or anything like that. So it was over a short period of time. My mother was born 5 days after the nurses were registered, 28th of December 1919. And I was kind of a late baby, but that's all right, I doubt that. But I still remember when I started here in November 73, she said she always wanted to be a nurse. And through the war years, my father deterred her and said things like, "Oh, you'll be called up to the front. You don't want to do that." He didn't want me to be a nurse either. "Oh, wait, when there's a war, you'll be called up to the front," and all this stuff, because they both went through the war years.
Yeah.
And I still remember saying to my mother, "Well, I'm going to be a nurse, and I'll be a better nurse than you'd ever be, because I'll be trained."
Yeah.
And I still remember the horror on her face, as if to say, "Do you need to be trained to be a nurse?" That's why I wondered what the public feeling might have been around that time about it, because we have very strong views today, don't we, about what nurses should be. Do they need a degree? You hear that comment, that type of thing.
Yeah.
So I just wondered if there was, whether it infiltrated out into the public, or was it kept kind of in nursing, or that they didn't have so much of an opinion.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to make, because a lot of what I've been saying is about infighting, if you like, within the profession itself, isn't it? And actually, I think there was a very strong public opinion that nursing was in the 19th century, it was seen as little different to domestic service, or, you know, a very good servant in a household could nurse, you know, the family, an ill family member. And the idea of domestic service and domestic nursing, it already had that two-tier quality to it as well, because the lady of the house would have knowledge of herbs and remedies and could sit by the bedside and read to the family member, but it was the domestic servants who would kind of do a lot of the personal care, cleaning the sick room, you know, creating a safe environment and doing a lot of the personal care, and fetching and carrying food, you know, the right foods and broths, which would all be listed in the book of the lady of the house, but she wouldn't actually be making them. So that kind of two-tier system was always there, and it was translated into the hospital setting, where a hospital ward in the 19th century was like a household, with the doctor as the patriarch and the sister as the matriarch, and then a number of nurses. But that idea that they were, you know, really, all they really had to do was be biddable and easy to train, in the sense of, this is what you do, these are the procedures, do them exactly this way. There would be one or two people in charge, the doctor and the sister, and the matron, you know, higher up in the hierarchy from the sisters. But the nurses themselves, this was a period really when it came to be accepted that they could actually begin to think for themselves. Intelligent obedience was the word that was used, the phrase, intelligent obedience. So the word intelligent was only added to that in the late 19th century. You know, it was just really about being part of the domestic team and making sure everything was clean, everything was safe, the patients were fed, you know, and the beds were clean, the beds were made. So I think that legacy has stayed with us. And yes, I've often heard throughout my career, I'm 59 now, and I've often heard since I started training in my early 20s, you don't need a degree to do that. Why would you need a degree to do that job? Yeah, and why? Because my training was a nursing degree, and I sometimes regret that, because I feel I haven't got the esprit de corps. I could have done a SRN in the hospital, but I chose, it was quite early on in the days of nursing degrees. And yeah, so many people said to me, you don't need a degree to, why aren't you doing medicine, Christine? A lot of people said that to me, especially my teachers as well. I had no interest in medicine. I knew that nursing was very different from medicine. I'm not sure how I knew. Yeah.
Can I just say that I totally get that, because when I went to sixth form, I was definitely going to be a nurse, and they kept saying, you know, be a doctor, do medicine.
Yeah.
And just picking up on Charlotte's point, we're sat here very proudly, City 18, from the degree course. Right. But actually, I think we have two of our nurse tutors here as well. I think Bart's and obviously Ethel's work has always been very innovative. And actually, I think the City course now, because we were schooled in the Hospital School of Nursing with the clinical placements on the wards, but then had the academic degree part at City University, it was that combination over nearly 4.5 years that I think is still innovative today. Because, yes, there's a lot of, you know, our hearts sank when we hear, oh, theory nurses, here they are on the wards. We work just as hard as everybody else. And reading Atonement, Ian McEwan, and you know, if everyone's read Atonement and listening to Bryony's experience of training in the Second World War, I recognise parts of that training in the 1980s. It was harsh at times, and it was hard. Yeah. But I think that nursing had to level up. It had no choice. But actually, I think the Bart's course got it right. You had the clinical skills training and the academic experience, but there was the loyalty to the hospital as well, where obviously now nurses are sent to many different hospitals and don't have that same loyalty.
Yeah, absolutely. It is strange, though, isn't it, that we, you know, those of us who trained, who did that kind of a degree entry into nursing, you know, I think probably it's quite a common experience that a lot of people would say to you, why are you doing that? You know, one of my aunts said, nurses don't need degrees, and why aren't you just going and nursing? Actually, you should actually be useful. You know, it's not useful, is it, to be in a university? And well, you think that lawyers could be useful and, you know, work through universities. You think that medical professors, you know, can work through universities, but somehow nurses, it's one of the things that I think it's really important for history of nursing to disentangle. And, you know, I think we're getting there really, you know, just how that legacy was created and how sometimes nurses, some very impressive and prominent and wonderful nurses actually worked against the profession without realising it. But even as I say that, I'm making a value judgment on, you know, in the historical context. You know, I think they just saw things very differently, and there may have been some good reasons for that. So I guess we just kind of, as a profession, we've just sort of clawed our way, you know, slowly and with a lot of obstructions. I think Ethel Gordon-Fenwick's story is often a little bit like the nursing profession itself in microcosm, you know, that there are obstructions put in your way, there are barriers put in your way. You know, you have to fight. The early nursing degrees had to absolutely fight to get, you know, to be established within the universities. So yeah, it's part of who we are, I guess. Yeah.
Just on a personal note, I just wanted to say that I think I was one of the first student nurses to get married at Barts in 1968, and I had to go to Miss Loveridge and ask her permission to be married, and then the first thing she said to me is, "Oh my dear, what if you get pregnant?" And I didn't get pregnant, and I got married as a student in my third year, and the first thing they did to me was put me on 3 months night duty.
Oh, you see, they'll always find a way to control your behaviour.
I'm afraid, for a variety of reasons, I did get married, and I wore my wedding ring on a piece of string round my neck. But unfortunately, the authorities somehow or other twigged this, I think, when they saw men's pyjamas in the laundry room. I had to bring washing home, because still living in the hospital. And that's why to this day, I begrudge it, because I had been here for over 4 years in the hospital. But they were very cross with me. So, and I had to go.
Oh, really?
Yes.
So you had to leave? So how long had you been there before you left? 4 years, did you say? Yeah. Such a waste, isn't it? Yeah, of a highly trained person. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. For anybody who couldn't hear that, it's just really interesting to remember, you know, for those of us who, I think we all can actually, nurses' homes and how important they were, you know, and how you could probably, do you think, throw yourself into the work and the training and the education because you were on site, your meals were, you know, all your meals, if you wanted, you know, were made for you, and you could. I think one kind of plus of that is that nurses could just really enjoy what they were doing, you know, learning their profession, learning their art. I know that I spent a lot of my time as a university nurse in minibuses, you know, being driven to and from different hospitals. I was in Manchester, and we lived in university halls of residence, and we'd get a minibus to Manchester Royal Infirmary, to Crumpsall North Manchester General Hospital, which was about 7 or 8 miles away, to Booth Hall for our children's training, which was even further away, and we'd be getting up at 5 a.m. to travel to different hospitals, which is why I personally, I feel as if I've missed out, you know, not having that kind of that experience of being part of a community within the hospital.
You build a lifelong friendship.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, yeah.
You were all locked in together, and I'd had a bad day. I'm leaving nursing, and all your set would be there to, and then tomorrow I'd had a good day, but Liz had had a bad day. I think we've got time for one more question.
I just wanted to think about the parallels to today,
Mm.
and I'm thinking very much in my head about physicians' assistants, advanced practitioners, and I also think we need to be mindful. I can see Carol Bavin sitting at the back, and the amazing contribution that the Station Road nurses made. And so, although we're talking about history as we're moving forward, to me it's really imperative that we still value what we consider to be nursing. But as I'm working at the moment, I'm looking at physician's assistants, I'm looking at advanced practitioners, and I think there's a place to take those skills forward, and that doesn't make us any less of a nurse.
Yeah, it's. I think these are kind of tricky issues where what we need to do is look at the different skill sets and how they overlap and how teamwork can give the patient a better experience. I've tended most of my life to be very attached to the idea that a nurse is a holistic practitioner and has, that the education that training and education that nurses used to get and still do get can equip them to have a range of roles, from the caring work, the bedside caring work, right through to the most technical work, minus surgery, and then what's really difficult these days is the paperwork and the litigation and but that nurses actually have to have a grasp of that as well. They're the linchpins, they're the absolute linchpins of it all. But then, of course, it's almost impossible for one person, let's say on a hospital ward, to do all of that, or is it? It's an endless debate, I think, for me. I don't like to see parts of nurses' roles being eroded. But that is just a personal thing for me. But at the same time, I think if nurses are the people who are engaging in that work and being part of the training, they've always done that. It used to be called the doctor-nurse game. Stein, a sociologist, referred to it, you're probably aware, as the doctor-nurse game. The nurses always steered other professions to do their work and actually knew better than the junior surgeon. The sister always knew better than the junior surgeon what the patient needed and what should be prescribed. So in a way, kind of the extended role of the nurse, but the introduction of different specialist roles, including physician's assistants, just recognises that there are many different areas of work that a team can fulfill without being too trapped within their roles, but at the same time having their own role acknowledged and not having that taken away from them, that autonomy taken away from them. It's very easy to get nurses to do all the work and look after everybody, the patients and all the other staff in the hospital, on the ward, in the community. It's very easy to get nurses to do that, to do all of that, but never acknowledge half of what they've done. There are different ways in which that trap can be sprung around them, different ways, 18th, 19th century ways and modern ways.
Thank you very much for such a full and interesting account of the life of Ethel Bedford.
Yeah,
Fenwick.
Bedford Fenwick. Yeah,
and a fascinating glimpse into the social history of. And I'm reminded, as we have been recently, of what Winston Churchill told the Queen in her very early days of. The more we know about our history, the more we can see into the future and how important that is. And I think you've been able to show us that today. And we are really pleased that we've been able to have a fuller discussion with you now, as I gather you're going to slip away.
Yeah, I can't get close
afterwards.
to anybody.
No.
Yeah.
So
I've got a cold, so
yeah.
no,
It's great that we've had this opportunity. But can I just say that in the 70s, when I trained in the early 70s, a colleague of mine had to go to Miss Loveridge too, and that was in the 70s. to get permission, and it was still frowned upon here.
Right.
That
Yeah.
we should not be married. No.
Right.
So it's great, and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to meet you all. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies. Just a few practicalities and arrangements for lunch. I always get slightly worried about the health and safety implications of serving lunch. So, those of you with a coloured spot on your label are to go and get your own lunch in a moment. Everybody else, the committee members will bring lunch to you. That should avoid too many people moving around the hall at any one time. However, prior to that, we will be bringing, just if everybody can stay in a seat, we will bring wine to you just as soon as it's ready. Can I remind you that for our benevolent guests, and Hilary, I'm sure, will help those, can sit at our table. The rest of you, just basically manage as best you can. If anybody has items of any other business for the AGM, which is after lunch, please find myself or Nikki during lunch. And we need to be back promptly to start the AGM at 1:45. Otherwise, everything just goes to pot. All right? Thank you very much.